It's interesting you talk about the sunspot cycles. I interviewed Ken Ring, the long-range weather forecaster. I saw him at a seminar. I think it was 2015. I went to see him at a seminar with David Burton, who's a GAN fanatic and forecasts commodity markets based on GAN analysis. And Ken Ring spoke quite a bit in there about sunspot cycles, and both of them at that time, to give them their credit, were forecasting the 2020 downturn. David was saying it was going to be very bad, and it did coincide with a sunspot cycle. So that was Ken Ring's analysis as to why it was going to happen at that time. So I will link to that interview. And I think I mentioned to you on the phone last night, Ken Ring has written an excellent book called The Lunar Code, which you said you had a copy of. And I think he's a very entertaining writer. So it's a very easy book to read. And I think it again shows how we can all learn from just observing, which was how Ken learned to forecast long-range weather cycles. He was a fisherman. He observed the weather, he observed the planets, and then he made these correlations. And of course, he's made some remarkably accurate forecasts, including forecasting the recent cyclone that's impacting New Zealand right now. I think he got the date for that right. So I will link to all of that. But we must get on to war cycles, because one of your forecasts as well was forecasting the Russia invasion of Ukraine to the day. Now, again, that's something that I don't know anybody else can claim to do. I know that David Murrin had the forecast out for the year, I think it was, of which that invasion would happen. And obviously, David Murrin is a friend of yours and a friend of mine, and very respected for the work that he does, and an absolutely lovely guy, but extremely intelligent man. But to get something like that down to the day is pretty impressive again, Andrew. So do you want to just give a little bit of a hint as to how you did that?
Yeah, so there's a whole series of different cycles, and I think this is probably something that most cycles forecasters, well, if they do it, they don't talk about it. But basically, you got to run it. Everything occurs when you get all three people going into the cafe. If we go back to that analogy, you've got to get a minimum of three things coming together. And what we're looking at here is you've got to look at timelines for Ukraine, you've got to look at timelines for Russia, and you've got to look at global timelines. And that's three different sets of information, and it's where they overlap that we're interested in. So that's sort of the easiest way I can put it like that. So yeah, we did give that date in the market timing report. We gave it a month in advance. One of the things, if I may jump ahead, is to the Hamas-Israel situation and the year ahead report for 2023. Yeah, 2023. We gave that was in January. We gave that first week of October as a clear date. That was an easier one to forecast because that was exactly 50 years on from the Yom Kippur War. And there were also a lot of subcycles, and we have a lot more data points to do with the activity that's been going on in the Middle East with Israel and the various other bodies. Now, I'm just going to, this is the most I've ever spoken openly about it here, about all the stuff we've been discussing, but you mentioned Ken Ring's work. Now, what we find is that if you talk to police, doctors, A&E people, they'll always say it's very busy on a full moon. And one of my dearest friends is one of the most senior firearms officer commanders in Britain, and she's also involved with hostage negotiation, etc. She was the first to say it always kicks off. And we were talking about this, and I was just explaining. So it's not just the full moon or the new moon; it's the proximity of the moon to the ecliptic or its extreme declination. And the phrase has been coined by a guy called Richard Nolly called a supermoon. So if you get a point in an extreme declination on the ecliptic and in perigee or apogee, where you get the really big moons when they're closest to the Earth, when they all coincide, you'll find that human sentiment gets more active and agitated. Now, relating this back to some of these global events, these can be short-term triggers. So where you see something like this, you will see, and I noticed especially all over the last 20 to 25 years, everything to do with outbreaks of conflict in the Middle East generally has been triggered on one of these more serious sort of lunations, syzygies as they call them. And the point really here is that you can see how human sentiment is really being impacted by whatever it is, electromagnetic radiation, whether it's the gravitational pull, and you can't, your average scientist, sorry, I'm cynical about certain scientists say, well, it's too far away to have any impact. But statistically, it's proven it does have an impact. And you've only got to go to the emergency room, the A&E department, and you'll see that it's much busier on a full moon, let alone a super moon or anything like that. So yes, human behavior does get agitated and irritated. So we look for these combinations together with the bigger cycles and then the smaller cycles. So that, the Hamas conflict in Israel tied up with that, but it was the gun was loaded with the 50-year Yom Kippur cycle as well, and also not just that, but we had the 45-year cycle coming in from the OPEC oil crisis and from the incidents and events leading up to that. So this is how it works. It's kind of like it's a little bit like I said earlier on in this, where 2029 or the back end of this decade is going to be interesting because we've got a 90-year cycle coming in from the outbreak of the Second World War, and then we've got the 100-year cycle from the market top and crash. So it's this whole idea of multiple cycles coming in and then shorter term cycles, fine tuning them.
And of course, alongside that, we've got the Kondratiev wave, which also has war occurring as we approach the peak, which is where David's analysis came in. That was what he was looking at. And anyone that studied the Kondratiev wave or read the original paper that was written on it will, they'll understand that it is kind of like a war cycle, as well as a commodity cycle and all of those other things that are pulled into it. And everyone has their own interesting theories behind it. I'm thinking about David as I'm talking about this because I've done so many interviews with him where he's talked about his the Kondratiev wave and the theories that he has behind it. So again, I'll link to that in the report that I write with this. I won't go into sort of detail about it now. And I was the other thing that I was kind of interested in because, I have been war breaking out in the Middle East is pretty significant to happen. Then we spoke about this on the phone last night about a lot of resonance with the lead up to World War II and how much we can see that's happening now with extreme unrest in the world. And that probably would hark back to what happened in the 1920s, because when you did get the Spanish flu and it was out of World War One, and there would have been a lot of, and what happened in Germany, the economics, what happened in Germany and the hardships that they were going through, which led to the rise of Hitler and this authoritarian, that we're obviously seeing it with Trump, the amount the majority that he won that election by, and how he's now sort of going out and doing whatever he wants and seeing no reason why he can't do whatever he wants. It's interesting watching him go in for the land grabs, particularly because my focus, we spoke last night, I mentioned it last night that, I was Jewish, so I have a real focus on that side of the world. I'm very biased when I look at it, and I always premise that in interviews that I do. But it was so interesting to see how he talks about Gaza. I think it's a prime thing. He's talked about various land grabs everywhere. I'm going to buy New Zealand, the Panama Canal, and now I'm going to go and buy Gaza. And in an interview, somebody said to him, well, buy it for what? How much are you going to pay? And he said, pay. We're just going to take it. There's nothing there. He's going to rebuild it. I mean, all of these things are they're so remarkable, to sort of see this coming out and then noticing the emotional reaction that would have. That you can see how the buildup is happening, and I guess that's what you're looking at. Were you watching though Israel specifically, where you noticed, okay, we're at this 50-year point from the Yom Kippur War? I mean, did you have a focus there? Because there must be points like this happening globally, in a lot of regions.
We have a YouTube channel. I on one of some of those. One of those I've I've put up a timeline that we keep, and we keep lots of timelines. I have a whole series of timelines, and the reason that Middle East is of interest to us as one of our biggest clients is one of the world's biggest oil energy traders, right? So so they're always interested in that, and if they can be ahead of the game on it, then that's worth not just tens of millions, hundreds of millions to them. Okay. So that's plus I also think it's one of the key drivers for the Western world. Let's just back up. So what happened after the Great War, the First World War, was that Germany was hit with huge reparations that led to things like the Weimar Republic hyperinflation crisis, and it had seen weak leaders all the way up to Hindenburg. And the idea is that you then get somebody come along who is trying to grasp the nettle, as it were. Now, what's been happening in America, arguably, the Biden administration this time was incredibly weak. There are I mean, I'm just going. Let's just preface this. I'm apolitical when I comment, when I write. There's no right or wrong. You support who you like, and for whatever reason, that's it. But we saw something similar. There are a lot of people that are critical of Barack Obama's administration and so on. So we look at all this going on. So what happens is that we do see this 84-year, 82 to 84-year revolutionary cycle coming. There's been weak governments, and people want a bit more leadership. And that's when somebody like Trump comes along with let's make America great again. Well, who else used making America great again was Ronald Reagan. Trump didn't invent that. That's it. And we had also now we just we're restating this as objective history. We're not condoning anything. We're not saying anything. But the same happened with Adolf Hitler. He came along, and basically Hindenburg hadn't been a strong leader. People had lost a lot of wealth. Germany was on its knees industrially, and he united people. Okay, and at the beginning, it was all done on reasonable policies. And then these things gather momentum, and then they get out of control. And they always in all these situations they tend to pick on a group to effectively persecute or whatever. And that's what tends to happen. It will grow into America. Immigration is a big issue at the moment, but in fact, immigration has been the biggest issue forever and a day. So you've only got to go back. You go back to anti-China sentiment that goes all the way back to the 1820s as well. There's no new thing. So that's what happens. People want a strong leader. So now they've got a strong leader. Those who love him, and I was in America last week, and people saying, well, it's all going to work out pretty well. We've just got to just sort of bite our lips whilst we lose a little bit of our pensions, our 401ks, our supers, all the rest of it, but it'll all be good. And there are others that are like, well, that's the end of my business, and I voted for him, and this is not what I expected. And if we go back to what I mentioned about McKinley, which was 3 45-year cycles, or 1.5 90-year cycles back exactly, the cost of everything went up sixfold, especially for farmers, and that started the populist movement. So I don't know where this is going to end in terms of the imperialistic side, where America has always needed to have dominion over other countries. It needs the raw materials, it needs the power. And if you look at this, actually, this is a really fascinating area. A little bit of a digression because it's not quite tied up with all the mathematical cycles yet. But we look at how European nations expanded, and of course, Great Britannia ruled the waves on the 1700s, 1800s, the British Empire, all this sort of stuff. And actually, it was the Second World War that became the tipping point. It was actually in the early 1930s, Britain started to lose a grip on things. And America did not want to participate in either the First World War or the Second World War. They wanted to have this idea of neutrality based on their geographical position. But in the First World War, the sinking of the Lusitania, they came in. The Second World War, 7th of December 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they came in. But this was the opportunity for America, leading all the way up to the atom bomb, that created its superiority, that put America as the global leader of the Western world. So this is this imperialistic cycle. We can talk about the 250-year cycle. We haven't mentioned that one yet. I write about that in Zero Hour. And this idea that America next year will be 250 years old. It's a death and rebirth situation. It's a big cycle. So is America about to jump to the next quantum level and take over everything, or is it about to be challenged by another superpower? Was that superpower Russia, or is it China? Well, it's looking evident it's probably China, because when Britain pulled out of places like Jamaica and Barbados, China had gone in there, and it's the usual trick. The superpowers all play the same card game. It's like, you need infrastructure, we're going to provide it for you. Here's the debt, you owe us that forever. That's it. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. And this does fall in cycles. But look at the number of inroads that China has made into South America, especially with Brazil and Argentina, wheat and soybean producing nations and so on. When Trump started putting tariffs on soybeans, actually that was a bit of an own goal, because the net beneficiaries became the South American farmers there. That was in his first administration, not this one. So this is the thing here, and his eyes on making Canada the 51st state. Well, that's kind of an interesting one as well. But it's only doing what every other superpower has been doing. China does it. Russia has been doing it to a lesser extent. Russia was in Cuba, obviously, and so on. And of course, America peddled this whole idea of, well, not peddle. I mean, it's a different. The whole idea is scare people because you don't want to have communism there, because it's the opposite of capitalism. So it's all about bringing fear in and using that to expand and gather the resources that you need. Now, one of the biggest issues that I wrote about 2-3 years ago was Afghanistan has a very high level of rare earths and so on, and the sudden withdrawal of America from Afghanistan. Now they blame it on Biden because he was in the presidency there, but I think Trump had already negotiated it. And again, I'm not pointing fingers. It's just there was a withdrawal. What happened there was China came all the way through very quickly. They'd already been investing heavily in Afghanistan, and that, if you look at the geography of the world, you can see how much closer that now puts them to the Straits of Hormuz, which is where all the majority of the oil production is. So they're now very close to Iran and so on. So there's that strategic thing that hasn't really been pointed out. But this is all part of everybody's imperialism. That's it. It's colonialization. It's imperialism. If you go, I have spent considerable amount of time in Africa. I'm lucky that I get to put my boots on the ground and see things for myself, and you can see how much China has gone in there as well and expanded and put roads, infrastructure in. One of the things that historically China tends to put some infrastructure in for the locals, so they actually support it, whereas America tends to get, sort of most of the American corporations get the deals and contracts, and as the Chinese do as well. But it's only a handful of people that benefit. Usually, the more dictatorial rulers of the smaller countries and the heads of corporations, whereas China has a little bit more of the spreading out, and that's it. So that's where we are with it. Greenland has been mentioned before. The Panama Canal was under American oversight, and it was handed back under the Carter Agreement in 1999. So, China has made some inroads there. And I'm not sure, I did see something day before yesterday about some agreement had been reached with America to position troops around it as well. So these are all strategic points. And I mean, this is what I find fascinating. So if we can find order, and how do we find the order? That was your real question. Run a timeline for Panama, run a timeline for each of these nations, run a timeline for America, run a timeline for major global events, and look to see if there's any alignments. And to be quite honest, sometimes there can be so much noise, it's difficult to make a interpretation at all.
Yeah, so that kind of leads me to come to the question. I mean, everything you said there is really fascinating, and when I've talked about this in my own writing, I can't see anything but an escalation of that war in the Middle East occurring. I feel like this is, for example, is one of the major threats to Israel is Iran. And Iran obviously has its proxies, of which Hamas is one. And I feel like, this is a chance really, if Israel's going to move on Iran, it would be now or never, because they have the backing from the US. And then, as you mentioned, we've got the major supply lines that are coming through that region of the globe. And then we have Trump vying for his land grab of Gaza, which is a very strategically placed piece of land. And we have some significant oil fields around there. And so if we do get war that outbreaks in the Middle East, that would pull other nations in. Then we have an alignment between China and Russia and that would and Syria that I feel is also extremely important if we do get an outbreak of World War III. And I think the horrific thing about thinking about this is not only specifically what it would do to markets and obviously oil prices and everything else sort of bundled into that, but also how it would affect our own lives. Because if you remember when Iran launched that rocket attack on Israel, the entire airline airspace of that region was shut down, and it caused absolute mayhem for a few days. I know Australians that were delayed getting back to Australia and couldn't make it back, and they had to planes were being diverted everywhere. So I mean, the thought of war occurring is not a nice thought for anybody. I think what my subscribers would be interested in knowing is, if World War II does break out, in your mind, how would that look? Have you looked into that? These are one of the things that I talk about with David Murray. Like, would there, like, how does a World War III appear today? David Murray wrote that book, Red Lightning: How China Won World War III, or something, in 2025. Is that kind of what you would see
I
occur?
don't quite see it like that because I think as you know, Dave's a very good friend of mine. He just lives down the road, so we speak very often. And um, I don't quite see it the way I think China has. So let's back up here. First of all, we talk about 4-year democracies and all the rest of it. China has a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 50-year plan, a 100-year plan. And we don't know what plans they have, right? Uh, but they're more solid because they're focused on the same thing. Whereas we chop and change, what do we have? We had Biden come in and by executive order, overturn a lot of everything that Trump did first from his first administration, and then the same thing happened again. So there's no consistency, or very little consistency. China, I think, has fought, and I use the term fought in inverted commas, economically. And if you've read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, if you the last thing you want to do is go into physical battle. So I don't think China need to do that. I think China are controlling quite a lot of stuff. Yes, they can I think Taiwan is at risk. TSMC is a major player, but America's built up chip building in certainly in Texas and places like that. So that wouldn't be the end of the world now. So I think you've got all this there as the sort of. I mean, my argument is that we've already been in the Third World War. It's really started with the Ukrainian stuff going on, and that's when the mathematical cycles came out. Because if you take 1939 and add 82 to 84 years, that takes us to 2021 to 2024. But then with the 90-year cycles coming up soon as well. So how would it look? Well, it's quite interesting. I was over in Wall Street with one of my big clients in February, and he said, "Well, we'll just go in there and go into Iran and just devastate it, and that'll be it, and everything will be okay." I don't think it works like that. I think what you're going to find is that they don't have a formal military. Well, they do, but they don't have anything of any great substance. So I think you'd have to be prepared for this idea of revenge attacks that are terrorist based. So I don't think American cities will be safe, major ones. I think that's how that will be if one country is going to strike another, you have to expect reprisals. So and it's not as simple as, oh, okay, you attack us, wipe us out, and that's the end of it, because we wouldn't have had all this conflict in the Middle East since the 1960s. So I think that's how it will work. I think America needs to be very careful. I don't think China is going to fire any weapons very easily. I think we are in that war already, but yes, I do think we are going to see some more devastation. For the most part, in the West, we're lucky, and we, Britain's defence capability is considerably reduced because politicians say we don't need it. We haven't had a war in ages. Well, they don't understand cycles, right? So, if you look at the what we call the quick response aircraft that get airborne to intercept airborne incursions, we've only got 2 sets of those flying. Apparently, in the 60s there were God knows how many. And over the years, I've flown with pilots who were involved that in the 70s and 80s and so on. So we don't have very much here. I think the wars are economical. I think the biggest threat, well, I know the biggest threat is cyber. So by the time you cut off the power, the internet, then you've got no utilities, you've got no way of paying for anything. You're not going to be able to get food. You're not going to get any distribution. I think that's the economic battle that could be won within a week or two. unfortunately, if it heads to that. So I know David's got a theory, hasn't he, that they have the various fleets that can attack everything overnight, and that would be it.
Yes.
I have read that book.
Yeah, whenever I interview David, I get emails that come in about how depressed subscribers I was. They've watched his analysis of what's to come, and then the first question is, the first thing is, their emotional reaction to, the world's about to end, and then the second one is.